Wonderful, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the planet. I'm Phil Howard, a professor at the University of Oxford, and I help manage the International Panel on the Information Environment. It's wonderful to have you joining us. We'll give another 30 seconds or so, people still filling in, I see, and then we'll start in. Fabulous. Well, let's begin. As I mentioned, I'm Phil Howard, and today we've got a session on AI and economic inclusion, led by a wonderful panel of colleagues and researchers, people from policy, civil society. And I'll say a little bit about the IPIE. We'll introduce our colleagues. Our wonderful colleague, Professor Jennifer Schradie from Sciences Po, has control of the PowerPoint, and so we'll keep us moving. As we go, there'll be several opportunities towards the end to ask questions, either through the chat or raising your hands, speaking up. Please feel free to change your name in the Zoom in your Zoom account to help identify who you are, where you are, institutionally and on the planet. It's wonderful to be able to join you here from Delhi during the AI Summit. There's a lot going on. There's certainly a lot of in-person and virtual conversations. And since several of us are here, we thought it would be a good moment to check in with the global network of the IPIE, the scientific community, and report up on a little bit of what we're hearing and seeing and finding through our work on AI and economic inclusion. The IPIE has been around now for 2 years. As a legal entity, we launched at the Nobel Summit in 2023. We've grown rapidly, now just shy of 500 scientists, researchers from 75 countries. We're about a third social science, a third computer science, a third humanists, but broadly a very open house, open tent of researchers who are interested in technology challenges, technology problems. They're interested in trying to improve public life, make it a better world for the generations ahead, and interested in figuring out what it is we need in technology design and in policy to build that better world. We're structured in terms of scientific panels. Each tackles a different topic with the overall broad mission to provide the most actionable scientific knowledge about threats to the world's information environment. This often means tackling questions or challenges or problems where there is a lack of data, and an important goal for us is to identify the areas in which scientific consensus is emerging when the platforms do share, when government does share. In that sense, having an arm's length relationship is always important for rigorous science, and it's very important for us at the IPIE. If we forward through a little bit, please, Jen, I can say a little bit about how thank you, this wonderful panel came together. Um, Perhaps you, Professor Schradie, can say a little bit about the mission and focus of the panel in particular. But we've met once together in Cape Town in December. The panel has composed an agenda for the year's work. We've got several milestones, including this presentation here in Delhi. We've got several milestones for the year ahead in which to tackle this very big picture question: what does the latest science say about the role of AI in bringing people in, providing opportunities economically, or excluding them, preventing some of the equality issues that we want to promote from actually being promoted. So I'll turn it over to Professor Schradie now from Sciences Po, helping to chair the overall panel. We'll have several minutes to hear from her on the research agenda, what the early preliminary findings are so far. Then we'll open it up and be joined by our wonderful colleagues, Dr. Janine Berg from the ILO, Professor Mimi Zhu from law faculty at the University of New South Wales, and Gbenga Sesan from the Paradigm Initiative, which has multiple layers of important experience to hear from on these questions of AI and economic inclusion. Professor Schradie, thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Howard. I'm so eager to present our panel's work while we're here in Delhi at the AI Summit. And so whether you're joining us from India or anywhere across the globe, I first just want you to consider in your country, perhaps a small farmer who may want to apply for crop insurance, but the insurance company uses an AI risk model that penalizes farms in this particular region due to increasingly climate volatility, right? And so wealthier farmers, of course, can hedge their bets with irrigation, private insurance, or other funds, but smaller farmers can't. And the insurance company or other corporations calls this AI system optimization, but this particular farmer may experience exclusion. So people like this farmer, you may have imagined, or someone trying to get a loan or possibly hoping for a job interview, or needing housing or benefits, and other everyday people needing to rely on AI systems are what is really at stake right now, beyond the AI hype that we're hearing about at the conference this week. So at the same time, what is key is who sets the evaluation metrics for AI system, economic systems in particular, and who is not part of that decision making, and how that power differential may matter for economic inclusion. So even though academics debate and others debate how long AI has really been around, how we're seeing it used now is a relatively new innovation. But of course, and society is built on historic inequalities, whether they're across social classes, genders, or across caste, or racial or ethnic categories. So AI then not only operates within unequal societies, but also between countries like the global North and the global South. And as we know, these past and existing inequalities become the training data for AI models. And many of you may be familiar with that type of bias. For example, people with lower levels of education are less likely to be represented online, so their realities and lived experiences are not as likely to be considered in AI systems. So any exclusions with that can, but don't have to scale automatically, right? So, but as of yet, in the scientific community, we really haven't yet had consensus on these levels of exclusion or the extent of them. So as a result, any harms, any potential exclusions may be too late. We also have very fragmented, if any, accountability on the impact of economic inequalities. So power remains really concentrated in the hands of AI companies and those who deploy them rather than everyone who may be affected by them. So what do we do? What is our panel doing? Scientific analysis remains so crucial, so we really understand the extent and scope of this problem. But within the academic scholarship on this topic, we've really found that inclusion claims with AI are rarely measured systematically, especially across countries. Evidence is also fragmented across various methods, whether qualitative, quantitative, computational, et cetera, as well as we lack comparisons across a whole array of economic sectors. I named just a few earlier, and we'll talk about some other economic sectors in a moment. So policymaking then, as a result, also lacks consolidated guidance on best practices. So our panel on AI and economic inclusion is tackling these core research questions, right? So first, how do economic inequalities such as income, education, occupation, and other differences shape the AI economic systems that are built today? And then in turn, how do AI systems themselves shape economic inclusion in a variety of sectors, whether with work or financial markets, for example? So what are we concretely doing? So first, our panel is addressing this question of inclusion in AI with inclusive research practices. So first, the members of our scientific panel are diverse regionally and by discipline. So we have sociologists, a legal scholar, economists, a computer scientist, et cetera. We're also putting together a systematic review of the existing research on AI and economic inclusion. And in so doing, are being inclusive of the databases that we're using. So not just those from the global north. At the same time, we're not just examining English language studies. Finally, we're not only examining quantitative research, but also computational and qualitative and other evidence in this process. And we're gathering this wide range of data because if we don't measure economic inclusion in AI systems systematically, we therefore can't govern them very effectively in the end. So specifically, our first steps for this global analysis is a process where we're drawing from a number of different databases with the work of Jessica Gold, our consulting scientists. And we've started with the first of three databases. So for this first phase, we started using Scopus, which is a database using three structured keyword clusters. So on the one hand, we have AI-related terms, and then economic and social sector terms, and then finally inclusion or exclusion terms. So we're able to retrieve documents that had at least one keyword from each of these clusters. And so when we considered publications, they were required to match at least one term, right, of each of these clusters, as I mentioned. And that yielded about 3,000 documents to begin with. And then based on preliminary screening and broader coding, about half of these publications we found were relevant. But to pilot this method, we've started with a case study in India within our larger corpus, leaving us with about in the end, about 73 relevant publications. And this is just an initial snapshot that I'm going to be presenting today and three preliminary findings. So the first preliminary finding in India relates to the economic sectors themselves that show up in existing research, with two domains or two sectors really dominating. First and foremost is agriculture. So in particular, rural and information and communication technology, or often called ICT-enabled farming. So this could include everything from e-agriculture and the use of generative AI for rural unemployment and employment and economic livelihood, right? So this is often framed as food security or climate resilience or poverty reduction. So the second key research emphasis in India on AI and economic inclusion revolve around financial services. So this could be microfinance recommender systems, fraud detection in social schemes, AI in banking, and also some fintech case studies and insurance innovations. Comparatively, though, there is little in this particular sample on AI and housing markets or labor markets, wage setting, or any kind of social protection, nor with everyday user experiences with AI systems. And in particular, we didn't find AI's effects on informal workers outside digital platforms. Again, this is in India with one database. So as a result, what we found in this case is inclusion research is not evenly distributed across domains. So certain risks and opportunities may be understudied simply because they fall outside these dominant sectors. It also shows the importance though of not just focusing on economic issues or starting with keywords that are just relevant to the global north as scholars, right? So the second preliminary finding is that research is largely design oriented, with authors proposing new systems such as loan recommenders or banking AI, often highlighting potential, not specifically measured benefits. We've seen a lot of studies on model performance metrics or on efficiency gains for institutions themselves rather than on individuals. The result is that we mostly have technical validation research, such as model accuracy, scalability, et cetera, and less on empirically evaluating long-term distributional outcomes, specifically, right, such as who might be excluded by these proposed or current systems, or even any power asymmetries in the system design. So, like in very simple terms, we know less about who benefits, who loses, and who is filtered out in this process. And really, for an economic inclusion agenda, this is critical. Right. So, for example, loan recommender systems may increase microfinance institutional growth, but do they merely shift lending toward less risky borrowers, right? Or biometric systems. We're seeing a lot of this. They may expand access for remote users, right, in rural areas to financial systems, but this relationship isn't always empirically demonstrated. And as a result, efficiency is not the same as equity. Right. And deployment of a system is not the same as inclusive impact. And that question of impact is really key, right? So we really need to move from can this work to who benefits and who doesn't with real empirical studies. So this is a large gap we've identified in this particular case study corpus of research in India. Finally, our third key finding shows that most research focuses on using AI to include people in markets, but fewer focus on who designs these systems in the first place and evaluating any differences there, right? Or data bias or representational inequality. So we know little about labor conditions in the AI supply chain itself, as well as in governance and accountability structures. And as a result, in the political economy of AI ownership and control. So one way that our panel has been thinking about this is AI for inclusion, or ideas for, for AI for inclusion itself is not the same as inclusion in AI. So AI can affect economic opportunities, and we'll definitely be tracking that. But existing inequalities can also shape who can engage with AI systems in the first place as well. So in this corpus, the first half of this equation, right, AI for inclusion, is very well represented, but the second half, inclusion in AI, and the actual impact is much thinner. So this suggests not only a major research gap, but also a policy gap, as economic inclusion really needs to address both outcomes and power levels for real change. So what's next? What are we doing? What is our committee up to? So in this current phase, our panel on AI and economic inclusion will expand globally beyond India, also incorporating two other key databases, OpenAlex and JSTOR, and also regional databases, as well as policy and other types of research, and will computationally analyze the full text in this larger corpus. So as we expand our project beyond this case study in India into the broader global context, we still have found it extremely useful to do this study in India because it offers several important takeaways on evaluating our evidence moving forward. So first, it's clear that sectoral variation matters in the economic sector, right? So agriculture may be prominent in certain contexts or certain countries, while other regions' research may focus more on labor automation or AI and manufacturing, for example. So we'll definitely be evaluating that. So second, we'll evaluate the scholarship and whether it has a bias in overall, not on an individual study level, but an overall bias in solutionism and publications on AI and economic inclusion, right? So across these contexts globally, where does research focus on AI can fix this versus AI has fixed this? So really, in so doing, we'll evaluate the hype versus the evidence, and our panel aims to map out where strong causal data actually exists, identifying where inclusion claims, again, are speculative or prospective, and distinguish between publications that focus on technical validation or institutional efficiency, as well as on household, community, or individual level impact, right? So, and on a variety of levels. So finally, this two-way relationship between AI and inclusion may be underdeveloped, but we aim to systematically examine how inequalities therefore shape data quality, and everything from, in addition to adoption or digital literacy in economic contexts and institutional incentives, right? Because we're really interested in impact. So what are some incentives for inclusion? Right. So, in effect, if economic inclusion shapes the data itself, it also shapes the model. Thank you. And we look forward to presenting our final results later this year on AI and economic inclusion. So, stay tuned.
Wonderful. Thank you for that quick tour, Dr. Schradie. It's noticeable listening to you and comparing with what we've been hearing here in Delhi, how much of a demand there is for metrics, for ways of measuring the impact of AI on economic opportunity. And one of the critiques I think that's emerged over the last couple of days is that each of the global summits seems, starting in the UK and then to Paris and then here, each one has developed different conversations about different metrics. So we're in this awkward moment of having several different ways of measuring um, the diffusion of AI and its impact on economic opportunity. But I want to open it up now to the larger group. Let's start with Dr. Berg from the ILO, and then Professor Zhu, and then we'll move to Gbenga, Sesan. Um, Dr. Berg, Janine, welcome. What are you thinking about, worried about, working on to do with the role of AI and economic inclusion?
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Howard and Professor Schradie. That was a really great presentation, Professor Schradie. I think the work that IPIE is doing on this panel on AI and economic inclusion is really important, which is why, as an economist with the ILO, I'm playing the role also as a scientific advisor on this panel because this topic is really critical for the world of work. So at the ILO, we've been looking now for several years on what are the potential effects really on the labor market, normally, naturally, since we cover the world of work, and doing a lot of studies on trying to measure potential exposure of certain occupations to the risk of job loss, but also other wider debates on what are the impacts on working conditions, job quality, and certainly wages. We know that there might be very important productivity gains. How those gains will be distributed is a very critical question. In the Indian context, it's interesting, really, the first findings of this review, because although it's very understandable that there's been an emphasis on agriculture, given the importance of agriculture to the Indian economy, it's surprising that there haven't been more studies, in my opinion, on what are potential employment effects in other sectors of the economy, and also what are some of the real impacts. So we know, for example, from our research at the ILO, that there's about 3% of jobs around the world that are at high risk of automation. It doesn't sound like very much, but it translates to about 75 million jobs. These jobs tend to be concentrated in clerical support occupations. Globally, it means that more women are affected. But from an Indian perspective, it means that certain sectors, such as the BPO sector, all the call center work, really is at risk. So it would have been useful. It would, I would hope that some of the scientific literature will start investigating a little bit more what are some of these potential effects on these sectors, what's actually happening, perhaps having some case studies on some of these sectors, and actually getting some real numbers as to what the impact are. Because without that evidence, without that data, it's very difficult for policymakers to react, to know what social protection measures to put in place, what income support is needed for these workers as they transition to other fields. Um, Training, also training is a big, of course, a really important issue. What training is needed. So all of these questions are really critical, and I would love to see more research in that area. I think I'll stop here for now and the other panelists.
Wonderful. And thank you. So let's go from Geneva to Sydney, Australia. Professor Zhu, what are you working on, worried about, thinking about with AI and economic inclusion?
Yeah, thanks so much, Phil. So I've been working a lot on China's AI ecosystem, particularly its regulatory and governance frameworks. Actually, I'm a former colleague of Janine, but haven't worked directly with her, but I was with the IOO in China and Mongolia and Asia Pacific for a while. So employment as a key aspect of economic participation is something that I I've done a lot of research, and so how it plays out in China in relation to the key themes that Dr. Schradie and her team's report highlights is actually how universal these challenges are, even if they manifest across different contexts and different economic and political systems. And so just reflecting on employment and labour markets in relation to particularly algorithmic hiring platforms that screens now hundreds of millions of candidates. So I'll use an example of a big platform in China that's called Boss Ziping. It integrated DeepSeek into its through app into its structure. And this is the country's largest recruitment platform. So there's about 225 million users. Integrated DeepSeek. Everyone probably knows what DeepSeek is. It's probably one of the sort of frontier large language models that sort of about this time last year kind of caused a bit of it certainly grabbed the world's attention, and it is being used by many different companies and sectors and government departments in China. And then in the context of this largest recruitment platform in the country, they've integrated DeepSeek to automate CV screening and candidate scoring. Now, there was recent research by a Chinese team that tested this system, sort of DeepSeek in the context of this recruitment platform, across STEM roles. So science, technology, engineering, medicine. They controlled for qualifications while varying only on age and gender. And the results, well, you probably can guess what those results are. So candidates that were aged 35 and above received lower scores, and that gap widened at 30. So if you sort of understand Chinese labor markets, and when you go to China, for many years, you will see ads that are actually, despite having age discrimination laws, they would be saying, we are only looking for job candidates 30 years old or under. Okay, so no surprise there that the study found that the systematic disparities discriminated against candidates aged 35 and above, particularly above 30. And no surprise again, female candidates, remember these are STEM roles, consistently scored lower than male candidates across all age brackets. And when you combine, because this discrimination is intersectional, at the age of 45, that gender gap was absolutely stark in terms of how significant the gap was for 45-year-old male candidates and 45-year-old female candidates. And so it's very interesting. The study looked at how the sort of systemic labor market discrimination, particularly against women, over a certain age in particularly certain areas of the labor market, like science, engineering, technology, has now been encoded into DeepSeek, the application of these large language models in, these massive employment recruitment platforms. And so, what can be done? This is not, I mean, you're probably not surprised at this result, but there was no until this study was done, there wasn't actually any testing of whether these sort of biases are replicated in DeepSeek's models. So this recruitment platform didn't go and do this testing, and so technical design choices really matter. And as we see here, they can entrench disadvantage, and so particularly in relation to women in STEM, where they've traditionally not been hired. There's a systemic bias, but also not just in recruitment, but also in pay as well. So I think this study is very interesting in sort of revealing sort of the impact of AI that exacerbates, not just reflect these biases, but actually operationalize it and really scale these biases. And of course, we still don't have the opacity. We don't have the transparency that these black boxes in AI models, like including in DeepSeek, entail. And so this opacity is across the board. It's not just in Chinese models, it's also in Western AI models. And so I do think that in terms of what can be done, I mean, I think there needs to be more studies like this. It's not easy to do, but I think also the move towards algorithmic auditing with explainability tools, certainly that's where we should be going, and certainly to monitor this bias before the harm is actually documented. Of course, there's regulatory and governance frameworks, but happy to talk about that perhaps in the discussion, because there is anti-discrimination law in China, right? So there are laws that prevent discrimination on gender and age, etc. But we can see here that they don't make a huge difference, and it's very difficult to prove until it's too late. So harm is detected way too late when the women engineer at 45 does not get the job. And it's very difficult for the individual candidate to actually challenge those decisions made by platforms. And so just to conclude, look, I mean, these AI systems in the context of economic inclusion, in this case, employment, they're not neutral. They are choices that are at scale about whose labor is actually valued. And even in a tightly regulated environment like China, where there are laws on discrimination and there are actually laws on AI, regulations on AI, we can see that algorithmic hiring that involves these large language models reproduce and amplify and operationalize these structural inequalities.
Thank you, Professor Zhu. Yes, it's always sobering to think about the scale at which something rolls out in China, and the way how deeply discrimination, social inequality can get entrenched, encoded when such large software systems manage people's economic opportunity. Let's turn to Lagos. Let's move to Lagos next. Our colleague Gbenga Sesan. Before we do, let me remind everyone we're about to open up to the Q&A. So you're welcome to use the chat window or raise your hand. Use that option. I'll be scanning both for questions to pull out and offer to the candidates, to the colleagues here. Gbenga, what are you working on, thinking about in the context of AI
Thank
and economic?
you, Philip. So let me say that I am not in Lagos, and I'm saying this so that I can excuse the internet. Just in case the internet is bad, blame Bujumbura in Burundi. Don't blame Lagos, Nigeria. But thanks. What am I working on? Paradigm Initiative just released a report on technology-facilitated gender-based violence. And I think that one of the most scary things for me as a person, in terms of AI and automation, is that we're going to be seeing, as we are already seeing, the acceleration of rights violations. I only need to say one word: grok, for everyone to understand how terrible unmasking people, stripping them of clothes with just one sentence, not writing a line of code, it's not difficult to do. It's really bad. I mean, we were looking at the report and we were asking ourselves questions about how people are getting more scared of technology. People are exiting platforms, not just because they don't know, not because they don't know how to use it, but because they know if they are there, if they share any image. So what you were worried about before was sharing intimate images of yourself. Now it doesn't even have to be an intimate image. It can be any image. It can be your most professional picture. Somebody will use an AI tool to convert that into something that they want. So it's basically accelerated violation of rights when systems are not checked. That's one of four. The second, and I'm glad, to hear Mimi talk about this earlier, discrimination. I use the word bias here, but, basically speaking from different angles. There's a widening of the systemic fault lines. I love stories. Let me tell you a short story. I applied for a visa recently. I have a Nigerian passport, so I always apply for visas. Some of you may not know how that feels, but it's a good feeling once in a while to be rejected and to laugh at the rejection because it's ridiculous, right? I applied to this country that I know for a fact is already testing automating their visa decision processes. I mean, they have this platform where they're testing, automation. And then I got a response. And the response was, we don't think you will go back home because you don't have significant ties to your country and you don't have economic means. I thought it was ridiculous because, come on. Well, because it was, to go for an executive course that my organization has already paid for, I reapplied again and I took my time to speak to these bots and to give them in their own language what they can understand about why we go back. And of course, you can imagine the application was approved. And this is, I suspect, because I left a message there to say, I would really prefer that there's human appraisal of or review of whatever decision was made before. And I think that this is a major challenge because what will happen with systems that are not tested and that are not checked is that they will widen the systemic fault lines. It's bad enough already that we have these fault lines. It's worse that they are systemic. It's even much worse that this is going to be accelerated. That's number two. The third is the challenge of economic, inclusion, which is core to what we're discussing today. Already, we have many levels of exclusion, including very recently biometric information. Myself and a colleague, who actually spoke on IPIE recently, just on one of our webinars recently, just published are publishing a book. We just released a report on biometric ID in Africa. And it will shock you to find out how many people are excluded by a system that was developed to include people, either because, they are, people with disabilities or because of the kind of work they do and how their fingerprints can be captured. And the challenge with automated decision making is that it could exclude even more. And that is a challenge. The final one, number four for me, before I try to suggest something we could do, which I've been talking about for almost 3 years now, is the navigation of data ownership in countries where data legislation is weak. We've all seen the new, literally, or you could call them authentic. These are AI-generated videos of films, remakes of films, popular individuals in the past who are long dead and have now been recreated as, normal people, and you can't tell the difference. Now, we're going to have a scenario where information and data will be automatically generated of people who are prominent in countries with weak data legislation. Now, that is going to be a problem because, if you're covered by the GDPR in the EU, you're fine. But if you're in a country where data protection doesn't really help you, then you're going to have a tough time proving that you are the real person and not that avatar. I hope it doesn't come to a time where I have to tell, Phil, hey, Phil, this is me. And then another avatar says, no, it's me, I'm Gbenga. And then we have to have that argument. But so where do we go from here? I think that we already have a template of how to solve part of this problem. It doesn't solve everything, but we have a template in human rights impact assessments, in data protection impact assessments, for AI systems as assessments. And I think this is important because bias, ethics, and all of the concerns must be acknowledged, and there must be a process that subjects every system, especially automated decision making, to a test that checks for every kind of bias being corrected, checks to be sure that the training data is not already, garbage in, garbage out. And maybe from there, we can build other things on it. Of course, we can talk about the profit motive of AI. You saw that play out on the stage in Delhi, where two major players refused to hold hands. If two CEOs do not hold hands, how do you expect their systems to hold hands? I mean, this is where it is. It's about the bottom line. It's not about the people. We should be asking the question, who benefits? And to be honest, it should be the people that we're building for. But unfortunately, the people who benefit the most right now are the investors and what they want. And that is a broken system.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that critique. We've got several wonderful colleagues' names. I recognize diplomats, people from the World Bank on our call today. So please craft some questions, drop them into the chat. If you've got a question from your particular experience, or work experience, organizational perspective, I'll certainly be welcome for the group. I'm curious for the panel. One of the things that has really popped here in Delhi is this idea of sovereign AI, and of course, sovereign AI seems to have several meanings for several different camps, right? And sometimes it means building AI systems that are locally contextually rich, right? So they serve people within a particular culture, within a particular country. Sometimes it means keeping data within a territory and developing AI applications in a way that respects the personal confidential records of the citizens in that territory. You've each identified different kinds of problems in different contexts. Is sovereign AI the solution to anything that you've identified here? And I might start with Professor Schradie and go in the same order. What does sovereign AI add or add anything to the debate or make it more complex?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting, yeah, so that is the theme, right, of the key theme of the AI Summit that folks are debating. And I mean, first off, it's just fascinating because, as a scholar in France, and, in France, we have the whole history of the Minitel, which I love talking about, right? It was France's own internet and computer system in the 1980s that existed, right? Before kind of the World Wide Web that a lot of us know and recognize. And in some ways, it wasn't sovereign AI, but it was a sovereign system that it controlled. And everyone, eventually, of course, it died out because of the World Wide Web and wanting to communicate globally. And I think that has been the focus of the internet the last 30 years is we need to make everything global. And a lot of big tech companies saying we need to take down barriers. And so for me, it's a very fascinating question. And to me, it gets back to what I was talking about earlier in terms of power and who's at the table making these decisions, right? So, I mean, on the one hand, we have, the European Union, which has a lot of democratic countries that, and a lot of decision making, and it takes a long time for standards to develop. So if we think of sovereign AI as a system of standards in a region or in a country, I think that's extremely relevant to our questions around regulating AI so that economic opportunities are expanded and that we have full economic participation. But if we have a pure idea of sovereignty, meaning data ownership, then I think what we're really facing is how, and I think that, I mean, it's interesting because regulation is certainly something that big tech is, critical of, but I think really it does come down to data ownership and who is able to control data. And that's something that I heard this week by tech executives, right? Saying data is like oil, right? It is a key currency. health data, et cetera. I mean, it's very explicitly told. And so I think there's going to be a lot of resistance there. In terms of, I mean, it's interesting because if, this is something I think our panel could tackle in terms of the data that is being used and trained on. And we've, heard of some stories of some folks in India this week, groups of women being paid for their participation in some of these AI models, right? So what does that look like long term? And are we talking about regulation, or are we simply talking about kind of a scattershot system of data and sovereignty?
Thank you. Yeah, Janine, then maybe.
Yeah, so I think from an economic and employment perspective, there's definitely a lot of advantages to having a push towards sovereign AI. I mean, one of the big risks about AI and then all the technology coming with it is that we're going to be exacerbating the digital divide between rich countries and poor countries. And so unless there is some sort of, overt policy to take control, at least on a regional level, of the data and maybe even create certain systems, the risks of the digital divide being exacerbated are definitely very, very real. There's also, from an employment perspective, I mean, there's a lot of advantages. On one hand, you would have systems that would be more responsive to the local environment, but there's also systems that you could regulate better. You have more control of you would have the control of the proprietary knowledge to understand what the algorithm is doing. So if it is discriminating against workers in recruitment or doing other problems, there would be a little bit more control. If you want to regulate some nefarious forms, for example, the emotional facial recognition, some of those kind of more problematic uses of the technology, you would have more of an ability to do so. But you would also be creating more jobs because you would need local software developers, people locally or regionally who are working on these issues. You would develop people with more skills. So I mean, there's a lot of good reasons why countries, or at least regions, because it might be hard and there's a lot of countries in the world, a lot of little countries. It might be very hard for little countries to be doing this, but certainly regional blocks to be moving towards that in that domain, I think is a positive move.
Yeah. Look, I think we have to be very pragmatic about sort of the power structures that currently actually they're exacerbated really by this so-called arms race in AI. And I think sovereign AI, to a large part, is probably aspirational in that context. And I'm talking about obviously the two global powers, China and US, particularly the US. And so, are we sort of, I totally agree in terms of the aspirations that sovereign AI could bring to counter sort of digital colonialism. Data is extracted from global south or other countries that are non-Western, and these algorithms are developed, these models are trained in the West, sort of data sets that don't encompass the range of cultural values, and then perpetuate certain biases because of the just these systems that are trained on limited data set in the West. But I do think that when you think about the whole infrastructure, it's sort of forcing countries really at the moment to think about the dependence on, for example, American chips, software, and like infrastructure. Like that's just something that I think all countries at the moment that are allies with America kind of have had to confront. And we know that US is no longer a reliable ally on many fronts, but the strength it has in AI, the whole ecosystem, from the chips to software and the whole infrastructure, it does mean that I just think AI sovereignty is something that may masquerade. The aspirational independence is masquerading the actual realities of digital colonization 2.0. it's
The
sort of,
geopolitics, yeah.
yeah, it's a structural dependency, which, I just think many countries, and it's the same with China. I mean, China is also exporting its large language models to the global south as well. And that digital divide, which Janine talks about, is very much speaks to that structural dependence of most countries in the world on these two global AI superpowers. And the Europeans can try, but I'm not seeing in terms of the frontier model developments and it's just or the infrastructure for AI. It would be great, I think, in terms of, we are talking about instead of going national, we should talk about like where all the middle powers that share certain values can come together, and share their resources to counteract the two dominant forces that are creating this sort of AI
Mm.
colonization 2.0. Yeah.
Yeah, the language of middle powers has certainly taken off in several areas. Gbenga, any thoughts on this question of what is digital sovereignty? And then we have a question from Professor Ogenga. Go
All
ahead.
right, thank you. So, I mean, the talk of AI sovereignty is in part a reaction to an existing, and I think everybody identifies what the problem is, in terms of at times north versus south, at times, aligning across the divides. But I want to propose a unique distinction between AI sovereignty and AI catastrophe. And by that, I mean, and we've been there before, right? Where the internet, people talk about how can you make sure the internet works for you in your country? And so you set up an internet exchange point, which is still connected to the global internet, but make sure that traffic locally is driven versus a splinternet where you split completely away from the internet. And I think that's sort of where we are right now. If all of the aspirations of making sure that AI works for the country is embedded, but we don't then turn it into a race where countries are then taking advantage of AI sovereignty to pursue surveillance agendas, then those are things we need to be careful about. I mean, there's the whole infrastructural challenge, and we've been here before with it, with data, where countries say we need data sovereignty. If you want to operate in our country, make sure you have all your servers in our country, and then you can't guarantee uptime in terms of power supply. You can't guarantee anything, and then the whole thing falls back on its head. So I think yes, we're trying to solve a problem, but there are red flags that fly for me immediately in terms of the work that we do in the global south and how talks of sovereignty almost always go into the opportunities for governments that have an agenda to conduct more surveillance and to violate more rights.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for your thoughts on this. Professor Frederick Ogenga, welcome. What are you thinking about? And just quickly, a quick question, quick intervention. Yeah.
Oh, can you hear me? Oh, yes. Thank you so much for the wonderful panel and interesting discussion here. I have more of a futuristic question, and I would like you to respond on whether or not you really found some remote data that could help you project the future of AI and economic inclusion in the context of evolution of digital currencies. We know that economics works with currencies, and we see where the world is going. And we, of course, know the controversies surrounding currencies like Bitcoin and WorldCoin, which was actually expelled from Kenya because of infringement of data privacy laws. So how would you see this shaping up going forward as far as economic inclusion is concerned? Of course, without being apocalyptic in your projection.
Thank you. Professor Schradie, any thoughts on currencies or how this fits in without being apocalyptic?
Right. I mean, we all often in tech have all these buzzwords constantly of what's going to be the big thing, but certainly, yeah, I mean, tons of scams for sure. And I think that, I mean, we are looking into kind of financial markets more broadly as part of our search for research on this. So I think absolutely, I think that kind of fits under that kind of umbrella of the types of economic inclusion that we're actually studying. And it'll be interesting to see if that does come up in other countries as well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for joining us. Thank you to the panel for participating from Delhi to Burundi and Geneva to Sydney. This is very much a live conversation, certainly in person here, but it's I've become fond of saying that it's not too late, right? We need to have these conversations and do the planning now, right? Over the next 12 months, 18 months, this is when the technology will seriously take shape and really become entrenched. I certainly want to thank Dr. Jessica Gold, who's the consulting scientist for the panel, who's contributed to much of what we know already. And just by way of wrapping up, would like to flag to everyone that we have another virtual briefing coming on the 23rd at 1 o'clock CET on child protection issues and social media. The links to that are available on our LinkedIn page and at our homepage. We've got multiple reports coming out this spring on our efforts to index what a healthy information environment is, and a meta-analysis on the role of AI in producing misinformation, in interfering with public conversations. So several outputs in the months ahead, and I hope you'll join us again for briefings on these other topics. Thank you all. Have a good evening. Have a good night. Have a good morning wherever you are.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.